The deadliest pandemic in modern history was not decided by a virus. It was decided by a calendar. 14 days. That is the gap between two American cities facing the same disease in the same month, with the same complete absence of medicine, and one city burying 8 times more bodies than the other. You arrived here thinking 1918 was a natural disaster, something that happened to the world, like an earthquake or a flood. It was not. The death toll, city by city, neighborhood by neighborhood, was determined by specific human decisions made in the first week of the outbreak, when the numbers were still small enough to ignore. The virus did not care about the decisions. It just counted the days it was given and multiplied. And the people who gave it those days had names, titles, and offices. Tonight, I want to walk you slowly and carefully through Wilmer Krusen's parade on Broad Street and the 8-to-1 death ratio it produced, through a physician's letter from Surgical Ward 16 at Camp Devens, through the Sedition Act that made honest reporting a federal crime, through a 73-year-old pathologist digging up the virus from frozen graves in Alaska, all the way to the CDC workforce cuts and the Ebola outbreak burning through Congo right now with no approved vaccine. Subscribe if you have not, settle in, and stay until the end, because the question you came in with, why did so many people die in 1918, is about to be replaced by a much more uncomfortable one. Why is the same math still running against weaker institutions right now? Let's get into it. On the morning of October 1st, 1918, 3 days after the largest parade in Philadelphia's history, a woman carried her 2-year-old brother's body to the sidewalk. Her name was Selma Epp. She was a child herself. And decades later, when she finally spoke about it publicly, the detail she remembered was not the death. It was the wagon. There were no coffins in the wagon, she said. Just bodies, piled on top of each other. 72 hours. That is how long it took for a city of 1.8 million people to go from a marching band playing John Philip Sousa on Broad Street, to bodies stacked in the hallways of every hospital in the city, to a municipal morgue built for 36 corpses now holding more than 500, to steam shovels digging trenches at a place called Potter's Field, while seminarians from a nearby Catholic school dug graves by the light of the October moon. And here is what should disturb you about that timeline. It was not a surprise. It was not unpredictable. It was not an act of nature that no human could have seen coming. There was a man. His name was Wilmer Krusen. He was the director of Philadelphia's Department of Public Health and Charities. And on September 27, 1918, one day before 200,000 people were scheduled to crowd together on the streets of his city for the 4th Liberty Loan Parade, he had the data in his hands. He knew the influenza had already hit the Philadelphia Navy Yard. He knew 600 sailors were sick. He knew some had already died. He had received direct warnings from physicians in his own department begging him to cancel the parade. And he let it proceed. That is not a natural disaster. That is a decision. A single, identifiable, reversible decision made by a single identifiable man in the second week of an outbreak. And it did not just fail to prevent what came next. It accelerated it by a factor that, when you see the actual numbers, should make you physically angry. Because here is the part that the history books tend to leave out. Philadelphia was not the only major American city facing this virus in September 1918. St. Louis was hit at almost exactly the same time. Same virus, same country, same era, same lack of antibiotics and antivirals and ventilators, same complete absence of any vaccine. The only difference was the decision. In St. Louis, a health commissioner named Max Starkloff looked at the same information Krusen had and made the opposite call. He shut the city down. Schools closed, theaters closed, saloons closed, public gatherings banned. He did it within 2 days of the first civilian cases. The result was an 8-to-1 difference in peak death rate. That is not a rounding error. That is not a minor improvement. Philadelphia's peak weekly excess pneumonia and influenza death rate hit 257 per 100,000. St. Louis peaked at 31. Those numbers come from a 2007 paper published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences by Hatchett, Mesher, and Lipsitch. The paper analyzed 17 American cities and found that the single strongest predictor of how many people died was not geography, not population density, not the age distribution of the city. It was how fast the city acted. And Philadelphia was the slowest. Not by days. By a window of approximately 14 days compared to St. Louis, 14 days. And in the mathematics of exponential growth, 14 days at a doubling time of 3 to 5 days is 3 to 5 doublings, meaning the virus was between 8 and 30, 2 times more established in Philadelphia by the time anyone tried to stop it. I want you to hold that number in your head, because the rest of this story is about why it exists, why it keeps happening, and why the exact same calculation that Wilmer Krusen made on the evening of September 27th, 1918, is being made right now, today, by people who have never heard his name. I want to slow down on the Navy Yard timeline, because the details matter, and because the details are what transform this from a story about bad luck into a story about a system producing a predictable output. The Philadelphia Navy Yard was one of the largest naval installations on the East Coast, and in September of 1918, it was operating at a pace dictated by the war. Sailors were arriving from the Commonwealth Pier receiving ship in Boston, where influenza had already established a beachhead. Around 300 sailors transferred from Boston to Philadelphia brought the virus with them. The first cases appeared at the Navy Yard between September 7th and September 11th, depending on the source. By September 17th, the virus had crossed the invisible line between the military installation and the civilian population. By September 24th, the Navy Yard was reporting dozens of new cases per day, and the first deaths among sailors had occurred. Krusen's department was receiving these reports throughout this period. He was not operating in an information vacuum. He knew that influenza was present in a military facility within the borders of his city. He knew it was spreading rapidly among a population of young, otherwise healthy men. He knew people were dying from it. And his initial public response was to reassure. He told the press that the disease would remain confined to the Navy Yard and would not spread to the civilian population. He publicly advised citizens to stay warm, keep their feet dry, and keep their bowels open. That is not a joke. That was the official public health guidance from the Director of Public Health in the 5th largest city in the United States, in the second week of a pandemic that would kill more than 12,000 of his residents in 6 weeks. Stay warm and keep your bowels open. The disconnect between what Krusen knew from the internal reports and what he told the public is the key to the entire story. The physicians in his department who were monitoring the Navy Yard situation were alarmed. They pushed for public warnings. They pushed specifically for cancellation of the upcoming Liberty Loan Parade. But the newspapers, operating under the self-censorship regime that the Sedition Act and the Committee on Public Information had created, declined to amplify their concerns. The Philadelphia Inquirer ran reassuring headlines. Other papers followed suit. The press was not just failing to warn the public. It was actively participating in the suppression of information that could have saved thousands of lives. And there is a critical detail about the parade itself that amplifies the tragedy. The Liberty Loan parades were not spontaneous local celebrations. They were organized by the federal government as part of a national campaign to sell war bonds. The 4th Liberty Loan Drive was a coordinated, nationwide effort. Major cities across the country were holding parades and rallies simultaneously. The political pressure on Krusen to hold the Philadelphia parade was not local. It was federal. The parade was not Philadelphia's event. It was Washington's event being held in Philadelphia. Canceling it would have been interpreted as a failure of patriotism, an admission that the city could not fulfill its wartime obligations, a signal of weakness at a moment when the national messaging demanded strength, unity, and unquestioning support of the war effort. I want to be specific about what Krusen was facing, because I think it is important to resist the temptation to make him a villain. Krusen was trapped, or believed himself trapped, between the exponential curve and the institutional framework. The curve was invisible. The framework was immediate, personal, and carried real consequences. The physicians telling him to cancel the parade were speaking in numbers and projections. The federal officials who expected the parade to proceed were speaking in the language of career consequences and patriotic obligation. And Krusen, like every institutional man before and after him, chose the framework, as the framework was designed to make him choose. On the morning of the parade, September 28th, the head of the Navy Hospital at the Yard told the Public Ledger newspaper that there was no cause for further alarm. "We believe we have it well in hand," he said. That same day, 200,000 people gathered on Broad Street, pressed shoulder to shoulder for hours in the warm September air. The floats passed, the bands played, the war bond pledges were collected. 72 hours later, every hospital bed in the city was occupied, and the dying had just begun. The mathematics of what happened in Philadelphia are not complicated. They are just unforgiving, and I want to walk through them carefully, because understanding why the first week of a pandemic determines everything is the difference between seeing what happened in 1918 as a historical tragedy and seeing it as a structural inevitability that has not been fixed. A virus spreads according to a value called R0, or the basic reproduction number. It is the average number of people one infected person will infect in a fully susceptible population. For the 1918 influenza, the best estimates put R0 at approximately 2. A 2004 paper in Nature by Mills, Robbins, and Lipsitch at Harvard estimated a median R0 below 3, with the most likely value around 2. That sounds modest. It sounds manageable. It is neither. Here is why. If every infected person infects 2 more, and each of those 2 infect 2 more, the numbers go like this. Day 1, 1 infection. Day 4, maybe 2. Day 7, 4. Day 10, 8. Day 13, 16. Day 16, 32. This does not sound like much. It sounds almost slow. And that illusion is the thing that kills people, because the virus does not care that the numbers look small on day 7. The virus does not know that your health commissioner is monitoring the situation. The virus does not wait for your hospitals to prepare. It doubles. And then it doubles again. And by the time the doubling becomes visible to human administrators sitting in offices reading daily reports, the invisible portion of the epidemic, the people infected but not yet symptomatic, the infections that have happened but not yet been counted, has already determined the shape of everything that comes next. Think about what that means in practical terms. If you have a virus with a doubling time of 4 days and you wait 1 week to act, you have not lost 7 days. You have lost nearly 2 doublings. The epidemic you now face is 4 times larger than the one you could have faced. Wait 2 weeks and it is 16 times larger. Wait 3 and it is 64 times. And here is the part that matters more than any of those numbers. Hospital capacity does not double. Morgue capacity does not double. The number of physicians and nurses does not double. The infrastructure of a city is fixed. The virus is exponential. The collision between those 2 facts is what produces the scenes that Selma Epp remembered for the rest of her life. Let me give you more of the city data, because the variation across the country makes the pattern undeniable and makes the Philadelphia outcome look even less like fate and more like choice. The Markle study in JAMA examined 43 cities, not just Philadelphia and St. Louis. Among those 43 cities, the spread in cumulative excess death rates was staggering. Pittsburgh reached 807 per 100,000. Not because Pittsburgh was uniquely unlucky, but because Pittsburgh's industrial infrastructure, its steel mills and manufacturing plants running on wartime contracts, created the same institutional pressure against shutdowns that the war bond drive created in Philadelphia. Closing the factories would have disrupted war production. And so the factories stayed open while people died around them. Grand Rapids, at the other end of the spectrum, registered 210 per 100,000, roughly 1/4 of Pittsburgh's death rate. Same virus, same medical knowledge, same complete absence of treatment, same calendar year. The difference was the speed and rigor of local public health decisions. Grand Rapids closed schools and banned gatherings early. Pittsburgh did not. I want to make these numbers tangible because percentages and per 100,000 figures do not land in the body the way death should. Philadelphia's cumulative death rate of 719 per 100,000 means that approximately 1 out of every 140 people in the city died. If you lived on a block with 200 houses, at least one house on your block lost someone. And not to old age, not to a chronic illness that had been progressing for years, but to a disease that was not present 2 months earlier. Your neighbor was alive in September and dead in October. In Pittsburgh, at 807 per 100,000, it was closer to 1 in 124. In Grand Rapids, at 210, it was 1 in 476. That is the difference between a neighborhood where death is visible on every street and a neighborhood where the flu was serious but survivable. And that difference, that 4-to-1 spread from the worst performing city to the best, was determined almost entirely by whether someone in a government office made a phone call in the first 3 days or the 3rd week. The companion Bootsma and Ferguson paper modeled what would have happened with optimal sustained intervention and estimated that cities could have reduced total mortality by more than 95% under ideal conditions. But no city achieved ideal conditions because no city sustained its interventions for the full duration of the pandemic. The median duration of closures and gathering bans across the cities studied was roughly 4 to 6 weeks, and every city that relaxed its measures saw cases rebound in a second wave, sometimes nearly as severe as the first. St. Louis experienced this. It lifted restrictions after about 6 weeks, cases surged again, and the city reimposed measures. The second wave was less severe than it would have been without the initial intervention, but it was a painful demonstration that the virus does not negotiate. It does not care about political fatigue or economic impatience. It exploits any loosening of the defenses with the same exponential indifference. And here is a finding that should have changed every subsequent pandemic response, and did not. In 2022, Correa, Luck and Werner published a paper analyzing the economic consequences of the 1918 interventions. Their conclusion was that cities that implemented faster and more aggressive non-pharmaceutical interventions experienced no additional economic damage compared to cities that delayed. I want to say that again, because it is the single most important and most ignored finding in the entire pandemic preparedness literature. The economic damage that the advocates for keeping things open were trying to prevent happened anyway. The pandemic itself, not the public health response, was the primary driver of economic contraction. Manufacturing output fell. Commerce slowed. Businesses failed. Consumer spending collapsed. All of this occurred regardless of whether the city closed its schools and banned its gatherings. The economy was going to be damaged by the pandemic no matter what. The only question was whether it would be damaged by a managed epidemic that killed fewer people or an unmanaged epidemic that killed more. Philadelphia's economy contracted during the fall of 1918, just as St. Louis's economy contracted. The parade did not save Philadelphia's economy. It destroyed Philadelphia's economy and killed 12,000 people on top of the economic damage that was going to happen regardless. The trade-off that Krusen believed he was making, economic continuity versus public health, did not exist. It was an illusion produced by the gap between immediate visibility and exponential reality. The visible cost of cancelling the parade was obvious, estimated, and attributable to the decision-maker. The invisible cost of holding it was distributed across future weeks, attributable to the virus, and measurable only in retrospect. That asymmetry in visibility is the exploit. The virus uses it every time, and decision-makers fall for it every time. Because the exploit is not a failure of intelligence, it is a feature of how human institutions process information under uncertainty. They discount the future and overweight the present. They respond to visible threats and ignore invisible ones. They are, in a word, linear, and the virus is not. A 2007 paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences by Bootsma and Ferguson at Imperial College London modeled this collision across multiple American cities during the 1918 pandemic. Their central finding was that maintaining public health interventions throughout the pandemic, not just implementing them, but sustaining them, could have reduced mortality by more than 40% on average. For San Francisco, which was among the better performing cities, they estimated that if the city had sustained its interventions from September 1918 through May 1919, deaths could have been reduced by more than 95%. 95% from the same virus, with the same medicine, which is to say no medicine at all, no antivirals, no vaccines, no monoclonal antibodies, no ventilators, nothing except the decision to act early and the discipline to keep acting. And here is where it gets worse. The math does not just reward early action, it punishes late action with a cruelty that violates human intuition. Because in an exponential system, the relationship between when you act and how bad it gets is not linear. It is not the case that acting on day 7 is twice as bad as acting on day 3. It is potentially 16 times as bad. The penalty for each day of inaction does not add, it multiplies. And that multiplication happens silently, invisibly, in the bodies of people who do not yet know they are infected, in rooms where no one is counting, in a mathematical space that the human brain was never designed to intuitively understand. The Hatchet paper plotted this beautifully across 17 cities, the ones that acted within 2 to 3 days of their first cases. Cities like St. Louis, Milwaukee, and Kansas City saw lower peaks, flatter curves, and dramatically fewer total deaths. The ones that waited, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and several others, saw spikes so steep and so tall that the graphs barely fit on the same axis. Pittsburgh's death rate reached 807 per 100,000. Grand Rapids, which acted earlier, came in at 210. Same country, same year, same virus. A nearly 4-to-1 spread in death rate between the best performing and worst performing cities, driven almost entirely by how quickly local officials made the decision to intervene. But here is the thing I keep coming back to. This is not a story about mathematics. If it were, the math would have been enough. Someone would have seen the curves, understood the exponential, and drawn the obvious conclusion. They did not. And the reason they did not is the same reason the curves will look the same next time. Because the decision to act early in a pandemic is never made in a vacuum. It is made against pressure. Economic pressure, political pressure. The pressure of people who have money at stake, elections at stake, morale at stake, and who do not want to hear that the invisible threat they cannot yet see with their eyes is about to become the only thing that matters. Wilmer Krusen did not let the parade happen because he was stupid. He was not incompetent. He was the head of a major city's public health department during wartime. He let the parade happen because the Fourth Liberty Loan Drive was a federal government initiative to raise money for the war effort. And 1918 was not a year in which any American official wanted to be seen undermining the war effort. The country was at war with Germany. Morale was considered a matter of national security. And the same federal government that was asking cities to hold Liberty Loan parades had also, just months earlier, passed a law that made it functionally illegal to say anything that might interfere with the war. That law was the Sedition Act of 1918. The Sedition Act, signed into law on May 16, 1918, was an amendment to the Espionage Act of 1917. It made it a federal crime to utter, print, write, or publish any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the form of government of the United States, or any language intended to bring the government into contempt. Violations were punishable by up to 20 years in prison and fines up to $10,000. I want you to understand what that law did to the information environment in which Wilmer Krusen was operating. It did not just silence dissent. It created a system in which the act of telling the truth about a public health crisis could be treated as a criminal act of sedition. If you were a newspaper editor in Philadelphia in September of 1918, and you ran a front-page story saying the government's Liberty Loan Parade was about to cause a mass casualty event, you were not just being controversial. You were, under a reasonable interpretation of the Sedition Act, committing a crime against the state. The machinery of this information suppression was not subtle. George Creel, the head of the Committee on Public Information, the federal government's official propaganda office, had established a system in which newspapers self-censored or faced consequences. One of Creel's associates, Arthur Bullard, articulated the philosophy explicitly. Truth and falsehood are arbitrary terms, he wrote. It matters very little if it is true or false. What mattered was whether the information served the war effort. And the idea that a deadly disease was sweeping through American military camps and threatening the civilian population did not serve the war effort. This is why the pandemic was called the Spanish flu. Not because it originated in Spain. Nobody seriously believed it originated in Spain. It was called the Spanish flu because Spain was neutral in the First World War, which meant its press was not censored, which meant Spanish newspapers reported on the disease freely, including a severe outbreak that sickened King Alfonso XIII. Allied nations, whose presses were censored, reported almost nothing. The name stuck, not as geography, but as an artifact of the information asymmetry created by wartime propaganda. The countries where the disease was worst were the countries where you were not allowed to say so. And in this environment, Surgeon General Rupert Blue stood up and told the American public, "There is no cause for alarm if proper precautions are observed." That quote is documented. It is not disputed. The most senior public health official in the United States, facing a virus that would eventually kill 675,000 Americans, told the nation there was no cause for alarm. I spent an unreasonable amount of time reading about Rupert Blue. He was not a fool. He was not incompetent in the way that incompetence is usually understood. He had been Surgeon General since 1912. He had managed plague response in San Francisco. He knew infectious disease, but he was embedded in a system that did not permit honest public communication about a threat. And he responded by reassuring instead of warning. John M. Barry, the historian whose book The Great Influenza remains the definitive account, described Blue as a master bureaucrat who failed to heed warnings or prepare, and Blue's reassurances became the template that every local official in the country used as permission to do nothing. In Chicago, the city's health commissioner John Dill Robertson declared, "It is our duty to keep the people from fear. Worry kills more people than the epidemic." In Philadelphia, the Inquirer ran an editorial telling readers to talk of cheerful things instead of disease, and Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, never made a single public statement about the pandemic. Not one. A disease that would kill more Americans than combat in the war that was consuming his entire presidency. And the president said nothing. That silence was not accidental. It was policy. I want to make the censorship machinery more concrete because describing it in the abstract does not capture how systematically it operated. The Committee on Public Information was not a suggestion. It was a federally funded operation with an annual budget in the millions, employing hundreds of people that maintained a network of 75,000 local volunteer speakers called 4-Minute Men who delivered approved talking points at movie theaters, churches, and civic gatherings across the country. The CPI produced propaganda films, posters, press releases, and newspaper guidelines. It did not technically have the legal authority to censor newspapers, but it did not need that authority. The combination of the Sedition Act's criminal penalties and the CPI's ability to deny access, resources, and cooperation to non-compliant publications created a system of informal censorship that was nearly as effective as formal censorship would have been. Under this system, newspapers that published stories about the true severity of the influenza faced not prosecution, but exclusion. Access to government sources dried up. Advertising from government-adjacent institutions disappeared. In some cases, postmasters refused to deliver publications deemed insufficiently patriotic. The effect was a press that self-censored, not because editors were unaware of the pandemic, but because the institutional consequences of honest reporting were more immediate and more personal than the consequences of silence. I spent time reading the Philadelphia Inquirer from September and October of 1918. The coverage of the influenza, even as bodies were piling up faster than the morgue could process them, was remarkably restrained. The earliest reports described the outbreak as a minor inconvenience. The word influenza was used reluctantly. Stories about the Liberty Loan Parade and the war dominated the front pages. When the death toll became impossible to ignore, the coverage shifted to reassurance, quoting officials who insisted the situation was under control, emphasizing individual prevention measures like hand-washing and avoiding crowds, and carefully avoiding any suggestion that government policy had contributed to the catastrophe. Compare this to what happened in Spain. The Spanish press, uncensored because Spain was neutral, reported the pandemic aggressively from its first appearance. Spanish newspapers published detailed accounts of the illness, its spread, its severity, and the government's response. King Alfonso XIII's own illness was front-page news. Spanish public health authorities issued warnings and recommendations based on the actual state of the epidemic, rather than on what the war effort required the state of the epidemic to appear to be. The result was that Spain looked like the epicenter of the pandemic, not because it was, but because it was the only major country telling the truth. The name Spanish flu was not a geographic label. It was a censorship artifact. It encoded, in 2 words, the entire information asymmetry of the First World War era. The countries where the disease was worst were the countries where you were not allowed to say so. and the country that told the truth got its name attached to a disease it did not create. Rupert Blue's role in this system was not that of an active deceiver. I do not believe he was lying when he said there was no cause for alarm. I believe he had internalized the institutional norms so completely that he processed the incoming data through a filter that automatically converted alarming information into manageable information. This is not unusual in institutional settings. It is, in fact, the norm. People who rise to the top of large organizations do so in part by learning to frame problems in terms that the organization can process without disruption. Blue's entire career had been spent learning to present public health challenges in ways that did not cause panic, did not undermine institutional authority, and did not create political problems for his superiors. When the most severe pandemic in human history arrived, he did what he had been trained to do. He managed the message. And the message he managed killed people. And while the policy of silence was operating in Washington and Philadelphia and Chicago, the virus was operating in places where silence could not reach it. Places like Camp Devens. Camp Devens was an army training facility in Aya, Massachusetts, about 35 miles northwest of Boston. It was built to hold 36,000 soldiers. By September of 1918, it was holding somewhere between 45,000 and 50,000. The first influenza case appeared on September 7th or 8th, depending on the source. The camp's physicians initially suspected meningitis. Within 2 weeks, 10,500 soldiers were sick. On a single day, 1,543 men reported to the hospital. The camp's medical facilities, designed for a peacetime training base, collapsed. On September 29, 1918, one day after the Philadelphia parade, a physician stationed at Camp Devens sat down in surgical ward number 16 of the base hospital and wrote a letter to a friend. His name was Roy. We do not know his last name. The letter was found decades later in a trunk in Detroit and published in the British Medical Journal in 1979 by N.R. Grist of the University of Glasgow. What Roy wrote is the most important primary source document from the 1918 pandemic, and I want to share parts of it because the clinical detail matters. These men start with what appears to be an attack of la grippe, or influenza, he wrote, and when brought to the hospital, they very rapidly develop the most viscous type of pneumonia that has ever been seen. 2 hours after admission, they have the mahogany spots over the cheekbones, and a few hours later, you can begin to see the cyanosis extending from their ears and spreading all over the face, until it is hard to distinguish the colored men from the white. It is only a matter of a few hours then, until death comes, and it is simply a struggle for air until they suffocate. It is horrible. He was describing acute respiratory distress syndrome, a condition that would not be formally named for another 50 years. The lungs of these men were filling with fluid so rapidly that they were drowning in their own bodies. Autopsies showed lungs that were swollen, saturated, and strangely blue. William Henry Welch, the most famous pathologist in America, the founding dean of Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, traveled to Camp Devens to inspect the situation. When he saw the autopsy results, he reportedly said, "This must be some new kind of infection or plague." Welch, who had spent his career classifying the known, was looking at something he could not classify. Victor Vaughan was there too. He was the Army's senior epidemiologist, dean of the University of Michigan's medical school, one of the most respected physicians in the country. What he saw at Devens would haunt him for the rest of his life. In his memoir, he described seeing dead bodies stacked like cordwood and wrote that he carried ghastly pictures that he wished he could destroy. Vaughan's recommendation after inspecting Devens was immediate and unambiguous. Stop the transfers. Stop moving soldiers between camps. The virus was hitching rides on troop trains. But the troop transfers did not stop, because there was a war on, and replacement soldiers had already left Camp Devens for Camp Upton in New York, carrying the virus with them. From Camp Upton, they shipped to Europe, and the virus went with them. I want to pause here and make sure the weight of this lands properly, because the institutional dynamic operating at Camp Devens is the same dynamic that operated in Philadelphia, and it is the same dynamic that I am going to show you operating right now. The information existed. The physicians at the front lines saw what was happening and described it with clinical precision. They sent their observations up the chain, and the chain, operating under wartime imperatives that treated morale and troop movement as higher priorities than disease control, absorbed the information and continued doing what it was already doing. Nobody in this story is a cartoon villain. That is what makes it worse. Krusen was not evil. Blue was not evil. The generals who continued troop transfers were not evil. They were rational actors embedded in a system that had been designed to prioritize one set of objectives, winning the war, over another set of objectives, protecting human life from disease. And when the two came into conflict, the system did exactly what it was designed to do. It chose the war. Every time. I want to be specific about what was happening inside the bodies of the people who died, because the pathology matters for the modern parallel. The typical pneumonia that physicians in 1918 were accustomed to treating was bacterial. It progressed over days or weeks. It responded sometimes to supportive care. What they were seeing in October of 1918 was something qualitatively different. Patients would present with what looked like ordinary influenza, fever and muscle aches and cough, and within hours, sometimes within 2 or 3 hours, they would develop the cyanosis that Roy described, the skin turning blue or purple or what the physicians called heliotrope, and then the lungs would fill with fluid so rapidly that the patient would essentially drown. The fluid was not ordinary inflammatory exudate. Autopsies showed hemorrhagic pulmonary edema, lungs that were bleeding internally, saturated with blood-tinged fluid that could weigh as much as 6 times the normal weight of a healthy lung. This was acute respiratory distress syndrome, a condition that would not be formally described and named until 1967. The physicians in 1918 had no framework for understanding it. They had never seen lungs do this. Welch's reaction at Camp Devens, his comment about some new kind of infection or plague, was the reaction of the most qualified pathologist in the country confronting a disease mechanism that did not exist in his professional vocabulary. The W-shaped mortality curve made this even more confusing for the physicians trying to fight it. Normally, influenza kills at the extremes of age. The very young and the very old. The middle-aged and healthy survive. In 1918, the mortality curve had a third peak, a massive spike centered on adults between approximately 20 and 40 years old. The people who should have been the most resistant to influenza were dying at the highest rates. It was as though the immune system itself had become the weapon, which, as we now understand, is exactly what happened. The virus triggered a cascade of inflammatory signaling molecules called cytokines, what immunologists now call a cytokine storm. The immune response, instead of attacking the virus with precision, launched a massive, dysregulated assault that destroyed the lung tissue along with the pathogen. Stronger immune systems produced more violent storms. The 20 to 40-year-old demographic, with its robust immunological capacity, was generating the most destructive responses. But there is a deeper layer to the W curve that was not understood until the 21st century. In 2013, Gagon and colleagues published a paper in PLOS One analyzing the age-specific mortality patterns, and found that the peak was centered with remarkable precision on people born around 1889 to 1890. Those individuals would have been infants or very young children during the Russian flu pandemic of 1889 to 1890. The hypothesis they proposed, building on the concept of original antigenic sin or antigenic imprinting, was that these individuals' immune systems had been primed in infancy by the Russian flu virus, and that priming created antibodies that not only failed to protect against the 1918 strain, but actually misdirected the immune response in a way that amplified the cytokine storm. Your first encounter with the flu, before you could walk, before you could speak, before you had any understanding of what was happening to your body, programmed your immune system in a way that would determine your survival probability 30 years later. The infants of 1890 became the corpses of 1918, and neither they nor anyone else knew it until researchers in the 21st century looked at the data with tools that did not exist during the pandemic. The total death toll from the 1918 pandemic remains genuinely uncertain, and that uncertainty is itself an indictment. The most commonly cited figure, 50 million, comes from a 2002 paper by Johnson and Mueller in the Bulletin of the History of Medicine. They acknowledged that their estimate could be understated by as much as 100%, meaning the true toll could approach 100 million. An earlier 1927 estimate, based on incomplete data, put the figure at 1.5 million. A 2018 reassessment by Spruenberg and colleagues argued for approximately 17.4 million, but that paper was criticized for underestimating mortality in regions with poor record keeping, particularly India, where the pandemic was devastating, but documentation was minimal. The honest answer is that the world lost somewhere between 17 million and 100 million people, and we will probably never be able to narrow that range significantly. For the United States specifically, the CDC estimates approximately 675,000 deaths. Nearly 200,000 Americans died in October 1918 alone, making it the deadliest single month in American history. To put that in perspective, total American combat deaths in the First World War were approximately 116,000. The flu killed more Americans in 1 month than the war killed in 19 months. And yet the war got the memorials, the parades, and the history books. The flu got silence. And the virus, which did not know there was a war and did not care, doubled. The virus that did all of this was an H1N1 influenza A. That classification would not exist until decades later, because in 1918, virology as a discipline did not exist. Physicians could see bacteria under their microscopes, but they could not see viruses. The influenza virus itself would not be isolated until 1930, 15 years after the pandemic, which means that while the pandemic was killing, nobody knew what was causing it. Think about what that means. The greatest mass casualty event of the 20th century. An event that killed more people than the First World War, more people than the Second World War, more people than any single plague outbreak since the Black Death, was caused by an organism that the medical profession could not see, could not name, could not isolate, and could not study. They were fighting blind. Every treatment they attempted, every public health measure they deployed, every quarantine they imposed was based on educated guessing. Some of those guesses were good, some were catastrophic. One of the catastrophic ones involved aspirin. In 2009, Karen Starkloff published a paper in Clinical Infectious Diseases, presenting evidence that the widespread use of aspirin at toxic doses may have contributed significantly to the death toll. Here is what happened. Bayer's patent on aspirin had expired in February of 1917, flooding the American market with cheap generic aspirin for the first time. When the influenza hit, the Journal of the American Medical Association recommended aspirin at doses of approximately 1,000 milligrams every 3 hours. That works out to roughly 8,000 milligrams per day. Some regimens went as high as 1,000 milligrams per day. For context, Modern dosing limits aspirin to about 4,000 milligrams per day for adults, and even that level carries serious risks. What JAMA was recommending was 2 to 8 times the modern maximum. At those doses, aspirin can cause pulmonary edema, fluid accumulation in the lungs. Starkloff pointed out that the symptoms of aspirin toxicity at those levels, hyperventilation, pulmonary edema, and hemorrhage, overlap almost perfectly with the unusual symptoms that physicians in 1918 kept reporting and could not explain. The mahogany spots, the hemorrhaging, the lungs filled with fluid. The death spike in October 1918 coincided precisely with the period of maximum aspirin dosing. I want to be careful here, because this is a hypothesis, not a proven cause. Starkloff's paper has been cited extensively, but also criticized. The pandemic was equally devastating in regions where aspirin was scarce, which weakens the argument that aspirin was a primary driver. What the hypothesis does illustrate, and what I think matters for this story, is that the medical profession in 1918 was not just unable to fight the virus. In some cases, its best-intentioned interventions may have been actively making things worse, and nobody knew. Because they could not see the virus, they could not test their treatments against it, they could not run controlled trials in the middle of a crisis, and the information environment created by wartime censorship meant that even the observations of frontline physicians were being suppressed, distorted, or ignored. The death toll from all of this, the virus, the decisions, the censorship, the bad medicine, the troop transfers, the parade, is genuinely difficult to calculate. The number most commonly cited is 50 million. That comes from a 2002 paper by Niall Johnson and Jürgen Müller published in the Bulletin of the History of Medicine. Their conclusion was that the global death toll was of the order of 50 million, and they explicitly noted that the real toll could be substantially higher, possibly as much as 100% understated, meaning the actual number could be as high as 100 million. An earlier estimate from 1927 put it at 21.5 million. A 2018 reassessment by Spree-Uffenberg and colleagues in the American Journal of Epidemiology argued for approximately 17.4 million, though that number was criticized for underestimating mortality in India, where record-keeping during the pandemic was minimal. The honest answer is that nobody knows. The range, somewhere between 17 million and 100 million dead, is itself a scandal of record-keeping. What is not disputed is that approximately 500 million people were infected, roughly 1/3 of the global population in 1918. In the United States, the CDC puts the death toll at approximately 675,000. Nearly 200,000 Americans died in October 1918 alone, making it the deadliest single month in American history. And the people who died were not the people you would expect. The typical influenza mortality curve is shaped like a U. The very young and the very old die at the highest rates. Everybody in the middle, the healthy adults with strong immune systems, survives. The 1918 pandemic did not follow this curve. It followed a W. There was a third peak, a horrifying spike, right in the middle of the age distribution, centered on adults between 20 and 40 years old. The healthiest, strongest segment of the population was dying at rates that made no epidemiological sense. The leading explanation for the W curve is what is now called a cytokine storm. The virus triggered a massive, dysregulated immune response, and that response, not the virus itself, is what destroyed the lungs. Stronger immune systems produced stronger storms. The very thing that should have protected young adults, their robust immunological capacity, became the mechanism of their death. A 2013 paper in PLOS One by Gagnon and colleagues went further, arguing that the mortality peak was centered on people born around 1890, which meant they had been infants or young children during the 1889 to 1890 Russian flu pandemic. Their immune systems had been imprinted with antibodies against the earlier virus, and when the 1918 strain arrived, those antibodies did not protect them. They primed the immune system to overreact. The concept is called original antigenic sin. Your first exposure to influenza shapes your immune response for life. And if that first exposure was to the wrong strain, your immune system will fight the next pandemic with the wrong weapons, and the fight will kill you. Your first encounter with the flu decided how your body would respond to every subsequent flu for the rest of your life. And in 1918, that decision, made in the bodies of infants who had no choice, no awareness, no agency in the matter, produced a death toll concentrated precisely in the demographic that should have been the safest. That is not a metaphor. That is immunology. In Philadelphia, the consequences of exponential math and bad decisions and censorship and a virus nobody could see played out in scenes that read like medieval plague accounts transposed to a modern city. The smell of decomposing bodies permeated entire neighborhoods. The city morgue at 13th and Wood Streets overflowed within the first week. 5 supplementary morgues were opened in cold storage plants. Bodies lay on porches, in hallways, in bedrooms where surviving family members were too weak or too sick to move them. On October 15th, 10 trucks carried corpses in a single day from the city morgue to Potter's Field at Luzerne Street and Whitaker Avenue in North Philadelphia. Highway crews used steam shovels to dig the trenches. 400 of Philadelphia's police officers were out sick. 16 police stations were converted into emergency health departments. Garbage collectors were sick. Streetcar drivers were sick. Telephone operators were sick. The entire infrastructure of daily life broke down simultaneously because the people who operated that infrastructure were the same 20 to 40-year-olds the virus was targeting with disproportionate lethality. The Department of Health and the city coroner temporarily suspended the ordinance requiring death certificates to be issued before burial. Think about what that means. The deaths were happening so fast that the administrative machinery designed to track them could not keep pace. People were buried without documentation, which means the official death toll, however high it was, is almost certainly an undercount. And then there were the children. Thousands of Philadelphia children were orphaned during the pandemic. Relief agencies were overwhelmed. Some children were found alive in apartments with dead parents, having gone without food for days. The writer Thomas Worth, in a paper published in Pennsylvania History, documented the systemic failure of municipal services, noting that thousands of city workers were out sick, including streetcar drivers, telephone receptionists, shopkeepers, and garbage collectors. The city, in a very real sense, stopped functioning. All of this, every body on every porch, every orphaned child, every trench dug by a steam shovel at Potter's Field, traces back through a direct and documented causal chain to one decision made on one evening by one man. Wilmer Krusen had the data. He had the warnings. He had physicians in his own department telling him to cancel the parade. And he let 200,000 people crowd together on the streets of a city where influenza was already killing sailors at the Navy Yard. He later assured the public that the situation had returned to normal by late October, even as people continued to die. He went on to become president of the Philadelphia College of Pharmacy and Science. He served in that role from 1927 to 1941. He died in 1943. There was no public memorial for the approximately 17,000 Philadelphians who died until the Mutter Museum of the College of Physicians of Philadelphia mounted its Spit Spreads Death exhibition in 2019. 101 years. It took 101 years for Philadelphia to publicly acknowledge what happened. But Wilmer Krusen is not really the point of this story. And I want to be clear about why. Because if this were just a story about one bad decision by one public official in 1918, you could file it under lessons of history and move on with your evening. The reason you cannot do that is that Krusen's decision was not an anomaly. It was not a personal failure. It was the predictable output of a system that was designed to produce exactly that result. And that system is still operating. I want to talk about St. Louis now, because St. Louis is the proof that the system can be beaten, and the story of how it was beaten makes the failure to beat it everywhere else even more damning. Max Starkloff was the health commissioner of St. Louis. He was born in 1858, and he had been in public health for decades by the time the pandemic arrived. Before the first case hit his city, Starkloff had done something that Krusen did not. He had been watching. He had been reading the reports coming out of military camps. He had published an editorial in local newspapers urging citizens to avoid crowds. He had established a network of local physicians on heightened alert. None of this required special technology or classified intelligence. It required paying attention to information that was publicly available and taking it seriously. St. Louis reported its first civilian cases on October 5th, 1918. On October 7th, 2 days later, Starkloff and Mayor Henry Keel closed schools, theaters, churches, saloons, pool halls, and all other places of public gathering. They banned public funerals. They restricted the hours of retail stores. And they did this over strenuous objections from businesses that argued the closures would cause economic damage. The objections were identical to the ones that prevented action in Philadelphia. Economic damage, public morale, the war effort, the same pressures, the same arguments, the same institutional incentives that told Krusen to let the parade proceed told Starkloff to keep St. Louis open. The difference was that Starkloff overrode the system. He made the call that the system was designed to prevent, and he did it fast enough that the exponential math worked in his favor instead of against it. The results were not ambiguous. The CDC's own analysis shows fewer than 2,000 influenza deaths in St. Louis compared to more than 10,000 in Philadelphia. National Geographic calculated approximately 358 deaths per 100,000 in St. Louis over the deadliest 6 months, versus approximately 748 per 100,000 in Philadelphia. The Hatchet Paper's numbers are even starker. Philadelphia peaked at 257 per 100,000 per week. St. Louis peaked at 31, 8 to 1. And here is the detail that I cannot stop thinking about. St. Louis was not a better city. It did not have better hospitals. It did not have better doctors. It did not have a smaller population or a more favorable climate or some geographical advantage that Philadelphia lacked. The difference was a man who made a different decision in the same window, 2 days versus 16 days. That is the entire distance between the curves. What made Starkloff different was not superior intelligence or better data. He had essentially the same information Krusen had. He read the same reports from military camps. He saw the same early cases. The difference was something harder to quantify, a willingness to treat the mathematical projection as real before the bodies confirmed it. Starkloff acted on the basis of what was about to happen rather than what was currently happening. And in an exponential system, that distinction is the difference between a manageable crisis and a catastrophe. But I want to be honest about something. Even St. Louis's intervention, which was among the fastest and most aggressive in the country, was imperfect. Starkloff maintained the closures for approximately 6 weeks, and then, under intense pressure from business owners and a public that was tired of restrictions, he lifted them. Cases surged again in a second wave. The city reimposed measures, but the damage was done. Bootsma and Ferguson's modeling showed that St. Louis's total mortality would have been dramatically lower if the interventions had been sustained through the entire pandemic. The early action reduced the peak and saved lives by keeping hospital demand within capacity. But the premature lifting allowed a second wave that partially eroded the gains. This pattern, early action followed by premature relaxation, followed by resurgence, repeated across almost every city that acted. The math demanded sustained intervention. The political and economic pressures demanded relaxation. And the virus exploited every relaxation with the same exponential indifference. There is a deeper cruelty in this dynamic that I think explains why the lessons of 1918 were forgotten and why the same mistakes were repeated in 2020. When you act early and successfully in a pandemic, the counterfactual is invisible. Starkloff saved thousands of lives. But those lives were saved in the subjunctive. They were the people who would have died if he had not acted. And you cannot see the subjunctive. You cannot photograph it. You cannot put it in a newspaper. You can only calculate it after the fact using mathematical models that most people do not understand and many actively distrust. What you can see, what is vivid and immediate and emotionally available, is the cost of the intervention, the closed businesses, the lost revenue, the bored children out of school, the cancelled events, the disruption to daily life. All of that is tangible and immediate and attributable to a specific decision made by a specific person. The businesses that closed because of Starkloff's order know exactly who to blame. The families who did not die because of Starkloff's order have no idea that they were ever at risk. This asymmetry in visibility is not a flaw in the system. It is a fundamental, structural feature of how exponential threats interact with human perception. And it operates with the same consistency in 2026 as it did in 1918. Every effective public health intervention in history has looked, in the moment, like an overreaction. Because the definition of an effective intervention is one that prevents the outcome that would have justified it. Starkloff was never thanked by the people whose lives he saved, because they never knew their lives needed saving. He was criticized by the businesses whose revenue he cost, because the cost was immediate and visible and attributable. History barely remembers him. The Hatchet paper cites him as a data point in a table of city responses. He is not a household name. He does not appear in documentaries. There is no monument to Max Starkloff's decision in St. Louis. Wilmer Krusen is also largely forgotten. But the system that produced Krusen's decision, the system that optimizes for the visible and the immediate at the expense of the invisible and the exponential, is not forgotten. It was never identified as the problem in the first place, and so it persists. But the math comes with a cruel caveat that is often left out of the telling. St. Louis lifted its restrictions after approximately 6 weeks. And when it did, cases surged again in a second wave. The Bootsma and Ferguson paper showed this clearly. Interventions that were implemented early but lifted prematurely reduced peak mortality dramatically, but had a more modest effect on cumulative mortality. The full benefit only materialized if interventions were sustained. And almost no city sustained them, because the same institutional pressures that delayed implementation also drove premature relaxation. The economy, morale, fatigue, people got tired of being restricted, and the political will to maintain restrictions eroded. This is the trap. The math says act early and sustain. The system says wait and relax early. The virus exploits the gap between what the math demands and what the system allows. And it exploits it every time. But I need to tell you what happened decades later. Because the story of how we eventually identified the 1918 virus is both scientifically astonishing and deeply uncomfortable in its implications for our current situation. In 1997, a molecular pathologist named Jeffrey Taubenberger at the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology in Washington did something nobody had done before. He extracted fragments of the 1918 influenza virus from preserved autopsy tissue. The tissue had been sitting in the Institute's warehouse since the pandemic itself. Formalin-fixed lung samples from soldiers who had died at Camp Devens and other military facilities, preserved in paraffin wax blocks and filed away in a storage room for nearly 80 years. Using polymerase chain reaction technology, Taubenberger amplified the degraded viral RNA and began sequencing the genome of the most lethal pathogen in modern history. The autopsy samples were badly degraded after 8 decades. He had fragments, partial sequences, not enough to reconstruct the complete genetic picture. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a retired pathologist named Johann Hultin, who had been quietly obsessed with the 1918 virus for almost half a century. Hultin's personal story deserves telling because it connects to the science in a way that makes the science human. In 1951, as a graduate student at the University of Iowa, the young Swedish-born pathologist had traveled to Brevig Mission, Alaska, a tiny Inuit village on the Seward Peninsula. The village had been devastated by the 1918 pandemic in a way that defied comprehension. In November of 1918, over a period of approximately 5 days, 72 of the village's 80 residents died. Virtually the entire community erased in less than a week. The dead had been buried in a communal grave in the permafrost, and Hultin hypothesized that the frozen conditions might have preserved intact viral material. He obtained permission from the village elders, dug into the permafrost, and recovered lung tissue from several bodies. He brought the samples back to the University of Iowa and attempted to culture the virus. The technology of 1951 was not up to the task. He could not recover viable virus. The project was abandoned. Hultin went on to a career in pathology, and the samples were eventually discarded. For 46 years, Hultin waited. In 1997, at the age of 73, he read about Taubenberger's work in Science magazine and recognized immediately that modern molecular techniques might succeed where 1950s virology had failed. He wrote to Taubenberger, offering to return to Brevig Mission. He funded the entire trip himself. He flew to Alaska, obtained permission from the village council once again, and excavated the communal grave for the second time. This time, he found what he was looking for. The body of an obese woman whose layers of subcutaneous fat had helped insulate her tissues from degradation had been remarkably well preserved in the permafrost. Hultin called her Lucy, a name he gave her out of respect, and the lung tissue he recovered from her body contained intact 1918 influenza RNA. He packed the samples in preserving solution, placed them in a cooler, and mailed them to Taubenberger at the Armed Forces Institute. Between Lucy's permafrost-preserved tissue and the degraded but complementary autopsy samples from the Institute's warehouse, Taubenberger's team sequenced the complete genome of the 1918 virus over the next several years. The final portions of the sequence, the polymerase genes that control how the virus replicates, were published in Nature in October 2005. And then, something happened that split the scientific community in two. A CDC virologist named Terence Tumpy used a published sequence to reconstruct the live virus. Not fragments, not partial sequences. The entire, functional, replication-competent pathogen, built from scratch using reverse genetics. The experiment was conducted under Biosafety Level 3 enhanced containment at the CDC's facility in Atlanta. When the reconstructed virus was tested in mice, the results were published in Science in October 2005. The 1918 virus generated approximately 39,000 times more virus particles in the lungs at day 4 post-infection than a contemporary human seasonal influenza strain. The mice lost significant body weight within 2 days and died within 6 days. The paper was named among Science magazine's breakthroughs of the year. The National Science Advisory Board for Biosecurity reviewed the publication before release and concluded the benefits outweighed the risks. But the debate was far from over, because what Taubenberger and Tumpe had collectively done was decode, publish, and physically reconstruct the most lethal pandemic pathogen in human history. The genome was now public. The proof that the genome could be used to create a functional, replication-competent virus was now published. Any laboratory with sufficient biosafety capability and molecular biology expertise could, in principle, recreate the pathogen that killed 50 million people. The controversy intensified in 2011 when 2 separate research groups, Ron Faucier at Erasmus Medical Center in the Netherlands and Yoshihiro Kawauka at the University of Wisconsin, independently demonstrated that H5N1 avian influenza could acquire airborne transmissibility between ferrets through a small number of mutations. Those experiments showed that the barrier between a bird flu that kills sporadically and a bird flu that spreads through the air between mammals was alarmingly thin. 39 scientists declared a voluntary research moratorium. The US government imposed a formal funding pause on gain-of-function influenza research in 2014. The pause was lifted in 2017 under a new oversight framework that remains controversial. The irony of all this is bitter and precise. We dug up the most dangerous pathogen in human history from a frozen grave in Alaska. We decoded its genome. We published the sequence. We rebuilt it in a laboratory. We demonstrated that closely related viruses could be engineered to transmit through the air between mammals. All of this was done in the name of understanding how to prevent the next pandemic. And the institutions that were supposed to use that understanding to prepare, to detect, to respond in the critical first week are the same institutions that are currently being defunded, dismantled, and deprioritized. We built the knowledge. We are dismantling the capacity to use it. Let me take you to January of 2020. A novel coronavirus is spreading in Wuhan, China. The first cluster of cases was identified in December 2019. By January 1st, 2020, the Huainan seafood market was closed. By January 7th, Chinese scientists had identified the pathogen as a new coronavirus. By January 12th, they had published its genetic sequence, but Wuhan officials denied human-to-human transmission as late as January 15th. The World Health Organization, relying on Chinese authorities, tweeted on January 14th that preliminary investigations by Chinese authorities have found no clear evidence of human-to-human transmission. The WHO did not declare a public health emergency of international concern until January 30th. The United States did not implement its first travel restrictions until February 2nd. By then, the virus had been spreading in communities around the world for weeks. The gap between when the information existed and when institutions acted on it was measured in weeks. And if this sounds familiar, it should, because it is the same gap that existed between the first cases at the Philadelphia Navy Yard and the closure order that came too late. Different century, different pathogen, same institutional architecture, same incentive to delay, same exponential penalty for delay. I want to be specific about what happened in those lost weeks of January 2020, because the specifics are what make the structural parallel inescapable. The science in January 2020 moved at a speed that would have been unimaginable in 1918. Chinese scientists had the complete genome of the virus published within 2 weeks of the first identified cluster. By January 20th, a team at Charité University Hospital in Berlin had developed a diagnostic test and made the protocol publicly available. By the end of January, multiple research groups around the world had begun work on vaccines that would eventually be deployed in record time. And while the science sprinted, the institutions walked. The WHO tweeted on January 14th, based on information from Chinese authorities, that preliminary investigations had found no clear evidence of human-to-human transmission. This was almost certainly wrong at the time it was published. Human-to-human transmission was already occurring, and Chinese physicians on the ground knew it. Li Wenyang, an ophthalmologist in Wuhan who had tried to alert colleagues about the new virus in late December, was summoned by police and forced to sign a statement admitting to making false statements that disturbed social order. He subsequently contracted COVID and died on February 7th, 2020. He was 33 years old. The WHO did not declare a public health emergency of international concern until January 30th. The United States did not implement its first travel restrictions until February 2nd. The European Union did not coordinate a significant response until weeks after that. In each case, the lag was not caused by a lack of information. The genome was published. The diagnostic tests existed. The epidemiological evidence of human-to-human transmission was accumulating in real time. The lag was caused by institutions needing time to process information, to consult with member states, to assess political implications, to weigh economic consequences, to draft and approve and communicate recommendations. Every day of that institutional processing time was a day of doubling, and by the time the processing was complete, the mathematical foundation of the pandemic had been poured. The epidemic was already global. The containment window had closed. What remained was mitigation, which is a polite word for managing a crisis that did not need to be this large. I am not interested in assigning blame for COVID's early response failures. That debate has been thoroughly litigated and has generated more heat than light. What I am interested in is the structural pattern, because the structural pattern in January 2020 was identical to the structural pattern in September 1918. Information existed. Frontline observers communicated it. Institutional machinery processed it at institutional speed. And the virus, which operates at viral speed, used the gap between the two speeds to establish itself beyond the point of easy containment. The gap in 1918 was approximately 14 days in Philadelphia. The gap in 2020 was approximately 3 to 4 weeks globally. Different century, different technology, different pathogen, same gap, same cause, same consequence. The system is consistently structurally 2 to 4 weeks slower than the math requires it to be. And that gap, that specific gap, is where the avoidable deaths accumulate. I am not saying COVID-19 was handled identically to the 1918 pandemic. It was not. The scientific response was faster. The development of vaccines was historically unprecedented, and many countries implemented public health measures earlier than their 1918 counterparts. What I am saying is that the window of delay, the gap between knowing and acting, the space in which institutional inertia and economic pressure and political calculation override the mathematics of exponential growth, that window still exists. It is smaller than it was in 1918, but it is not gone, and the math has not changed. A doubling time of 3 to 5 days does not care that you have better technology, if your institutions still need 2 to 3 weeks to make a decision. Correa, Luck, and Werner published a paper in 2022 analyzing the economic effects of the 1918 interventions and found that cities implementing faster and more stringent measures experienced no additional economic damage compared to cities that delayed. The pandemic itself, not the public health response, was the primary driver of economic disruption, which means the argument that Krusen was protecting the economy by allowing the parade was wrong not just morally, but factually. The economy was going to be destroyed either way. The only question was whether it would be destroyed by a managed epidemic or an unmanaged one. And the unmanaged version killed more people and caused more economic damage. This finding has been replicated across multiple contexts. The economy versus public health framing, the idea that early action carries an unacceptable economic cost, is empirically false. It is a framing that feels true because human brains discount future costs and overweight immediate ones. The cost of closing schools and businesses is immediate, visible, and attributable. The cost of not closing them is distributed across future weeks, invisible, and attributable to the virus, not to the decision maker. The asymmetry in visibility is the exploit the virus uses every time, and it is using it right now. In March of 2024, the United States Department of Agriculture confirmed the first detection of H5N1, highly pathogenic avian influenza in dairy cattle. This was unprecedented. H5N1 had been circulating in wild birds for years, had caused devastating outbreaks in commercial poultry, and had spilled over into humans sporadically since 1997. But it had never been found in cattle. The jump from birds to dairy cows represented a new host adaptation, a new evolutionary platform for the virus to explore. And it spread. By March of 2025, the CDC reported 989 dairy herds across 17 states with confirmed H5N1 infections. The human spillover numbers were not large. As of August 2025, 70 total human H5N1 cases had been reported in the United States since February 2022, with 2 deaths. One of those deaths was the first in the country, a Louisiana patient over 65 with underlying health conditions who had been exposed to infected poultry, reported by the CDC on January 6, 2025. The overall public health risk was assessed as low. But here is what the historical case fatality rate for H5N1 looks like globally. Between January 2003 and December 2024, the World Health Organization recorded 954 confirmed human H5N1 cases across 24 countries. 464 of those cases were fatal. That is a case fatality rate of approximately 49%. The CDC cites a figure closer to 52%. 52%. Compare that to the 1918 influenza, which had a case fatality rate of roughly 2 to 3%, and compare it to COVID-19, which had an infection fatality rate well under 1% for most of the pandemic. H5N1 kills more than half the people it infects. The reason it has not caused a pandemic is that it does not yet transmit efficiently between humans. Every human case so far has been linked to direct contact with infected animals or contaminated environments. No sustained human-to-human transmission has been documented. Yet, the word yet is doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence. Because what virologists know, and what the gain-of-function experiments by Fuchs and Kowalka demonstrated in 2011, is that H5N1 can acquire airborne mammalian transmissibility with a relatively small number of mutations. The dairy cattle reservoir is a new environment for the virus to evolve in. Every new host species is a new evolutionary laboratory. And in 2025, the Global Virus Network published a warning in Lancet Regional Health Americas that reassortment between H5N1 and human or swine influenza strains could result in reassortant strains capable of efficient human transmission. A 2025 study from Indian researchers modeled what would happen once a pandemic H5N1 strain began spreading in humans. Their finding was that the window for effective containment would be approximately 2 to 10 detected cases. Beyond that, containment would become almost impossible. 2 to 10 cases. That is the window. That is the margin. That is the number of confirmed human-to-human transmissions that separates a containable outbreak from a pandemic. And if the case fatality rate of such a strain retained anything close to the 52% observed in current H5N1 spillovers, the death toll would make 1918 look like a footnote. I am telling you this not to scare you. I am telling you this because the institutions responsible for detecting those first 2 to 10 cases, for acting in that window, for making the call that Starkloff made instead of the call that Krusen made, those institutions are currently being dismantled. I need to be more specific about the H5N1 situation, because the specifics are what separate this from hypothetical hand-wringing and make it an active, present-tense threat assessment. H5N1 was first identified in domestic geese in Guangdong Province, China, in 1996. It jumped to humans for the first time in Hong Kong in 1997, infecting 18 people and killing 6, a 33% case fatality rate in its first human encounter. That outbreak was contained by the mass culling of approximately 1.5 million chickens in Hong Kong's live bird markets. But the virus did not disappear. It continued circulating in wild bird populations across Asia, Africa, and eventually spread worldwide. In 2020, a variant belonging to H5 clade 2.3.4.4 B triggered an unprecedented wave. It killed wild birds in numbers never previously seen, devastating seabird colonies and wiping out populations of pelicans, gulls, and terns across multiple continents. Tens of millions of domestic poultry were culled or died of infection worldwide. And the virus began showing up in mammals, in marine mammals along the coast of South America, in foxes and bears in Europe and North America, in domestic cats, in seal. Each mammalian infection was an evolutionary experiment, a chance for the virus to acquire mutations that improved its ability to replicate in mammalian cells. Then, in March of 2024, it did something it had never done before in recorded history. It appeared in dairy cattle in the United States. That jump was alarming for a reason that goes beyond the immediate agricultural impact. Cattle are mammals with respiratory systems far more similar to humans than birds are. The more time H5N1 spends replicating in mammalian cells, the more opportunities it has to acquire mutations that enhance mammalian adaptation. The jump to dairy cattle was not the virus arriving at the doorstep of human pandemic potential, but it was the virus moving into a biological neighborhood much closer to that doorstep than the one it had been living in. By early 2025, CDC reported 989 dairy herds across 17 US states with confirmed H5N1 infections. 70 human cases had been documented, mostly among dairy and poultry workers, mostly mild, primarily conjunctivitis or upper respiratory symptoms. One death, the first US fatality from H5 bird flu, occurred in a Louisiana patient over 65 with underlying conditions, reported in January 2025. The overall public health risk assessment was low, but the historical global mortality data tells a very different story about what this virus is capable of. Between 2003 and late 2025, the WHO recorded approximately 1,000 confirmed human H5N1 cases globally across more than 24 countries. Nearly 500 of those were fatal. The overall case fatality rate is approximately 50%. Not 5%. Not 10%. 50. I understand the caveats. The confirmed cases almost certainly represent a biased sample, skewed toward the sickest patients. Mild and asymptomatic infections are undoubtedly being missed, which means the true infection fatality rate is lower than 50%. The clade circulating in U.S. dairy cattle, 2.3.4.4b, has produced milder disease in the humans it has infected than the clades responsible for the high fatality cases in Southeast Asia and Cambodia. It is possible, even likely, that a pandemic strain derived from the current dairy-adapted virus would have a substantially lower fatality rate than the historical average. But even a fraction of 50% is catastrophic at scale. The 1918 influenza had a case fatality rate of roughly 2 to 3%. COVID had an infection fatality rate well under 1% for most populations. If a pandemic H5N1 strain killed even 5% of the people it infected, that would represent a 90% reduction from the historical case fatality rate, an optimistic scenario, and it would still be 2 to 3 times more lethal than the 1918 virus. If it infected a third of the global population, as the 1918 virus did, the death toll would be measured in the hundreds of millions. Jeremy Rossman, a virologist at the University of Kent, was interviewed by BBC Science Focus for a year-end 2025 analysis of H5N1 risk. His assessment was unambiguous. The situation was completely out of control, he said. Effective containment, he argued, requires extensive surveillance of infection in multiple animal populations, as well as monitoring and testing for animal workers at these farms. But in the United States, the response is more limited and variable from state to state and farm to farm. Without strategic and coordinated surveillance and containment, he concluded, the risks of a human transmissible H5N1 virus will steadily rise, with unknown but potentially critical consequences. A 2025 modeling study from Indian researchers found that once a pandemic strain began spreading in humans, the containment window would be approximately 2 to 10 detected cases. Beyond that threshold, containment becomes functionally impossible. 2 to 10. That is the margin between a containable cluster and a global pandemic, and the surveillance systems that would need to detect those first 2 to 10 cases, to identify them in real time, to sound the alarm before the doubling becomes unstoppable, are the systems that have been losing staff, losing funding, and losing institutional capacity since February of 2025. The window is 2 to 10 cases. The doubling time is measured in days, and the people whose job it is to look through that window have been told their positions are being eliminated. In February of 2025, the Trump administration terminated approximately 1,300 CDC employees. That represented roughly 10% of the agency's total workforce. The cuts hit offices related to respiratory disease surveillance, injury prevention, and chronic disease. In October of 2025, a second round of mass firings struck during a government shutdown, decimating additional divisions. According to CNN, all staff at the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, a journal that had published surveillance data on the nation's health for more than a century, were fired. The entire publication staff. Gone. A former CDC director, Deborah Oury, told NPR that the damage is beyond repair. Crippling CDC, she said, even as a ploy to create political pressure, means America is even less prepared for outbreaks and infectious disease security threats. The proposed fiscal year 2026 budget would cut CDC funding by 53%. The Public Health Emergency Preparedness Program, which funds state and local health departments to prepare for outbreaks, faces a 52% funding reduction specifically. Over 100 public health programs and funding lines would be eliminated under the proposal. Simultaneously, the United States withdrew from the World Health Organization. The withdrawal removed the single largest financial contributor to the international organization responsible for coordinating global pandemic response. Experts including Jennifer Nuzzo at Brown University and Lawrence Gostin at Georgetown University warned publicly that the agency was being severely weakened precisely when it was needed most. And in May of 2025, while the United States was not participating, the 78th World Health Assembly adopted the first WHO pandemic agreement by consensus. 124 countries voted in favor, 0 voted against, 11 abstained. The United States did not take part. The agreement was designed to improve global pandemic preparedness, pathogen sharing, and coordinated response. Key operational details, including the pathogen access and benefit sharing annex, were deferred to the 79th World Health Assembly in May 2026. I want to make sure the structural parallel is clear. In 1918, the Sedition Act and the Committee on Public Information created an environment in which honest reporting about a public health crisis was suppressed. Officials who should have warned the public instead reassured them, and the institutions that existed to protect human life from disease were subordinated to other institutional priorities. In 2025 and 2026, the institutions that exist to detect pandemic threats are being financially gutted. The global coordination mechanism is being abandoned. The surveillance systems that would identify those critical first 2 to 10 cases are being defunded. And the agency that publishes the data is having its staff fired. The mechanism is different. The Sedition Act criminalized speech. The current approach defunds the capacity to generate the speech in the first place. You cannot suppress a surveillance report if the surveillance is not being conducted. You cannot censor a warning if the people who would issue the warning have been laid off. The information does not need to be silenced if the infrastructure that produces the information has been dismantled. And the exponential math is still there, waiting, and then, as if to demonstrate the point with almost theatrical precision, it happened. On May 15, 2026, the Ministry of Health of the Democratic Republic of the Congo confirmed an outbreak of Ebola disease in Ituri province in northeastern Congo. Within 48 hours, the World Health Organization declared it a public health emergency of international concern. As of the last week of May, more than 500 suspected cases and more than 130 suspected deaths have been reported across the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Uganda. The strain is Bundibugyo, a variant for which there is no approved vaccine and no specific treatment. The Ebola detection delay deserves careful attention because it is not hypothetical and it is not historical. It is happening in real time. The outbreak was confirmed on May 15, 2026, in Ituri province in northeastern Congo. But the outbreak did not begin on May 15th. It had been spreading for weeks before that date. The WHO's disease outbreak news report from May 17th noted that as of May 16th, 8 laboratory-confirmed cases and 246 suspected cases had already been reported, along with 80 suspected deaths. You do not accumulate 246 suspected cases and 80 deaths overnight. This outbreak had been building for a significant period before the international community became aware of it. The doctor sees Ituri province is a conflict zone. Armed groups operate in the region. Government control is uneven. Access for international health workers is difficult and sometimes dangerous. Under normal circumstances, international organizations like you said, Médecins Sans Frontières, and who partnered NGOs maintain a presence in these regions, providing both healthcare services and informal surveillance. Their workers, operating in remote clinics and community health programs, serve as the earliest human sensors for unusual disease patterns. When something abnormal appears, an unexpected cluster of deaths, an unusual presentation of symptoms, these field workers are often the first to notice and the first to raise the alarm. In Ituri province, that early warning network had been degraded. USAID's mission in the dark was shuttered in the previous year as part of broader foreign aid restructuring. The closure removed American-funded programs that had been operating in exactly the kind of remote, conflict-affected area where the Ebola outbreak emerged. Fewer international health workers meant fewer eyes on the ground. Fewer eyes on the ground meant a longer time between the first cases and the first detection. And in an exponential system, every day of additional detection delay translates directly into a larger epidemic at the point of discovery. At the May 17th press conference, where the WHO declared the outbreak a public health emergency of international concern, a CDC official was asked directly whether funding cuts had contributed to the delayed detection. The official did not respond to the question. CDC had learned about the outbreak on May 14th, the day before the drug show publicly announced it. The agency that is supposed to be at the center of global disease surveillance found out about a major Ebola outbreak one day before the press release. Jeremy Knindik, who worked on the 2014 West Africa Ebola response under the Obama administration and is one of the most experienced outbreak responders in the United States, told NPR that the USAID closures and CDC reductions had directly weakened the international surveillance infrastructure. He pointed specifically to the WHO's shrinking emergency response capacity, driven by the loss of US funding after the US withdrawal from the organization, as a factor that reduced the speed and scale of international response. I want to connect this back to the math, because the math does not change depending on the pathogen. Ebola has different transmission dynamics than influenza. It spreads through direct contact with bodily fluids rather than through the air, which makes it less contagious in casual settings, but also means it tends to concentrate in healthcare facilities and among caregivers. The R0 for Ebola varies by outbreak and by context, but typically ranges between 1.5 and 2.5 in the absence of interventions. The doubling time depends on the setting, but can be as short as 2 to 3 weeks in an active outbreak. Even at a slower doubling time than influenza, the same principle applies. Every week of undetected spread means a larger epidemic at the point of discovery, and the containment effort required grows not linearly but geometrically with a delay. The difference between discovering an outbreak with 10 cases and discovering it with 250 cases is not a 25-fold increase in difficulty. It is a fundamentally different category of problem, requiring different resources, different logistics, different political will. The Bundibugyo strain circulating in this outbreak has no approved vaccine. The existing Ebola vaccines, including Merck's RVSV-Zebov, were developed for the Zaire species and are not effective against Bundibugyo. Experimental candidates are being evaluated, but they are not yet ready for deployment, which means the response to this outbreak depends entirely on the non-pharmaceutical interventions, contact tracing, isolation, safe burial practices, community engagement that have controlled every previous Ebola outbreak, all of which depend on having enough trained personnel, enough funding, enough international coordination, and enough time. The first 3 have been reduced. The 4th was consumed by the detection delay. 2 things about this outbreak matter for this story. The first is timing. The WHO declared the emergency on May 17th, but when did the outbreak actually start? NPR reported that CDC only learned about the outbreak on May 14th, the day before it was publicly announced. More than 200 people had already been infected, and more than 80 had already died before the disease was even identified. The delay in detection occurred in a conflict zone, where international aid workers, who often serve as the earliest eyes on unusual disease outbreaks, had been pulled back. USAID's mission in the Democratic Republic of the Congo had been shuttered the previous year. The second thing is the response. The CDC that is responding to this outbreak is an agency that has lost 10% of its workforce, is operating with proposed budget cuts of 53%, has had its international coordination capacity reduced, and is working in the absence of full WHO partnership due to US withdrawal. Former CDC Director Tom Frieden warned that the weakened agency could struggle to mount an effective response. Jeremy Konindick, a disaster response expert who worked on the 2014 Ebola response, told NPR directly that the shuttering of USAID programs has limited the US ability to respond, and that a shrinking budget at the WHO, driven most notably by the US withdrawal, has reduced the size of WHO's International Emergency Division. The Ebola outbreak may or may not become a broader crisis. That is not the point. The point is the pattern. The point is that in the first days of an outbreak, when the exponential math is still small enough to control, the institutions that exist to detect and respond are weaker than they were 1 year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago. And the window, those first days and weeks when the curve can still be bent, is exactly the window that institutional weakness makes harder to exploit. This is the logic that Wilmer Krusen operated under. Not malice, not ignorance. A system that, when faced with a choice between immediate institutional priorities and the invisible, exponential, future cost of inaction, chooses the immediate. Every time. I want to come back to the math one more time, because I think the sheer elegance of the trap gets lost in the human stories. In an exponential system, the variable that determines outcome is not the total duration of the event. It is not the severity of the pathogen. It is not the size of the population. It is the timing of the inflection point, the moment when the growth rate is brought below 1. Every day before that moment, the system is doubling. Every day after, it is shrinking. And the total area under the curve, which corresponds roughly to total illness and death, is overwhelmingly determined by when that inflection occurs. If you act on day 3 and bring R below 1 by day 10, the total epidemic size is small. If you act on day 17 and bring R below 1 by day 24, the total epidemic is not just bigger. It is catastrophically, geometrically, irreversibly bigger. Because the doublings between day 3 and day 17 do not add to each other. They multiply. And you cannot undo multiplication. You cannot go back and undouble the people who were infected during the days you were waiting. They are infected. They will infect others. The damage is embedded in the system. This is why the Hatchet Paper's finding is so important and so damning. The 14-day gap between Philadelphia's response and St. Louis's response represented 3 to 5 doubling times. That means, by the time Philadelphia acted, its epidemic was between 8 and 30, 2 times larger than St. Louis's was at the same point in its response timeline. Philadelphia's hospitals did not have 8 to 30, 2 times the capacity. Philadelphia's morgue did not have 8 to 30, 2 times the space. The same number of doctors, the same number of nurses, the same number of beds, but an epidemic that was an order of magnitude larger, crashing into that fixed capacity like water into a basement. And here is the part that I still do not know how to sit with comfortably. The total capacity of the system does not increase between pandemics. If anything, it is decreasing. The number of hospital beds per capita in the United States has been declining for decades. The number of trained epidemiologists at the CDC is being reduced. The funding for public health preparedness is being cut, which means that when the next exponential curve arrives, the fixed capacity it will crash against will be smaller than the fixed capacity that failed in 1918, smaller relative to the speed of the threat. The pattern, once you see it, repeats with the regularity of a mathematical proof, and the proof has the same structure every time. Step 1. A pathogen emerges in a population. The early cases are few, scattered, and invisible to institutional surveillance systems designed to detect established patterns, not novel ones. The doubling begins in silence. Step 2. Frontline observers, the physicians, the nurses, the field workers, the people with their hands on patients, identify the problem. They attempt to communicate what they are seeing upward through institutional channels. The information enters a system that was designed to process it according to institutional priorities that have nothing to do with pandemic response. Step 3. Institutional decision makers receive the information and weigh it against competing pressures, economic, political, reputational, logistical. The information says act now. The pressures say wait. The decision makers wait, not because they are negligent, but because every incentive in the system rewards waiting and punishes premature action. Acting early on a threat that does not materialize is career-ending. Failing to act early on a threat that does materialize is attributable to the virus, not to the decision maker. Step 4. The doubling continues. Each day of the delay, each day in which the institutional machinery is processing, deliberating, consulting, and weighing, the epidemic grows by a factor that is invisible but relentless. By the time the exponential curve becomes visible to leadership, visible on charts and in hospital reports and in newspaper headlines, it has already determined the scale of the crisis. The window for early intervention has closed. Step 5. Institutions mobilize. Often massively and effectively. Emergency powers are invoked. Resources are deployed. Field hospitals are built. Morgue capacity is expanded. All of it necessary. All of it valuable. And all of it addressing a crisis that is already larger than it needed to be, by a factor determined entirely by the length of the delay in steps 2 through 4. The avoidable fraction of the death toll, the deaths that would not have occurred if the decision had been made in the first week rather than the third, is not small. In Philadelphia, it was measured in thousands. Globally in 1918, it was measured in millions. Step 6. The crisis recedes. The acute phase ends, whether through immunity, burnout of susceptible populations, seasonal dynamics, or the eventual effectiveness of interventions. Institutional memory begins to fade. The lessons are published in academic journals. Retrospective analyses confirm what the math predicted all along. And the institutions return to their default operating mode, the mode that will produce the same delay when the next pathogen arrives. That pattern played out in Philadelphia in 1918. It played out globally in January and February of 2020. It is playing out in the Ebola detection delay in the Democratic Republic of the Congo right now, in May of 2026, where an outbreak burned through communities for weeks before the international system was even aware of its existence. The mechanism changes. Wartime censorship in 1918. Institutional opacity and information management in 2020. Defunding and dismantlement of surveillance capacity in 2026. But the structure is invariant. And the structure is invariant because it reflects something fundamental, possibly irremediable, about how human institutions relate to exponential processes. Institutions are linear. They were built by linear thinkers for a world of linear problems. They process information linearly, make decisions linearly, allocate resources linearly, and respond to stimuli linearly. They hold meetings, they request additional data, they convene advisory panels, they draft memos, they circulate drafts, they seek approval. Every step in the decision chain takes time, and every step is designed to ensure that the decision is defensible, proportionate, and aligned with institutional objectives. All of these are reasonable goals in a linear world. In an exponential crisis, they are the mechanism of catastrophe. The theoretical solution is straightforward and has been articulated by epidemiologists for decades. Pre-commit to action triggers. Define, in advance, objective, measurable thresholds that automatically initiate public health interventions when crossed. Remove the discretionary step. Take the decision out of the hands of the person sitting in Krusen's chair, not because that person is incompetent, but because the system they operate in will consistently, structurally, predictably produce the wrong decision during the only window when the right decision matters. If a novel pathogen with confirmed human-to-human transmission and a doubling time of less than 1 week is detected in a population center, non-pharmaceutical interventions begin immediately. Not after a committee meeting, not after an economic impact assessment, not after a press conference. Immediately. The trigger is crossed, the response fires, the decision is pre-made. Like an airbag deploying on impact, you do not sit in the driver's seat and weigh the economic cost of the airbag against the probability that the collision will be fatal. The sensor fires and the bag deploys. No major country on Earth has implemented this. And the reason is that implementing it would require institutions to commit, in advance, to bearing visible costs in the present, based on a mathematical projection of the future. It would require politicians to pre-authorize actions that voters will perceive as overreactions if they succeed. It would require the entire institutional architecture to be redesigned around a category of threat it was never built to handle. And so the architecture remains. And the next pathogen will enter it the same way the last one did, and the one before that. And the person sitting in the chair will do what the person before them did. They will weigh the immediate against the abstract. They will choose the visible over the invisible. And they will be 2 weeks late. The math has not changed since 1918. R0 for a novel influenza strain is still going to be somewhere between 1.5 and 3. The doubling time is still going to be measured in days, not weeks. The window in which early action can bend the curve is still going to be measured in the first 1 to 2 weeks. And the penalty for missing that window is still going to be geometric, irreversible, and measured in human bodies. What has changed is the infrastructure we built to exploit that window, and it is being taken apart. I have been thinking about this for weeks, and I keep arriving at the same uncomfortable conclusion. The lesson of 1918 is not that one man made a bad decision. The lesson is that the systems in which decisions get made are designed to produce bad decisions during the exact window when good decisions matter most. In the first week of a pandemic, the numbers are small, the hospitals are not full, the morgues are not overflowing, the streets look normal, and every decision to close schools, cancel events, restrict gatherings, and shut down economic activity looks like an overreaction. It looks disproportionate. It looks like panic. Because the evidence that would justify the action, the bodies, the overflowing hospitals, the steam shovels at Potter's Field, is still in the future. It has not happened yet. And human institutions do not act on futures. They act on presents. By the time the evidence is present tense, by the time the hospitals are full and the bodies are stacking up, and the exponential curve has become visible to every newspaper editor and health commissioner and elected official in the country, it is too late. The window has closed. The doublings have already happened. The curve is already too high. And now you are Wilmer Krusen on October 3rd, finally closing the schools and banning public gatherings, and the virus does not care that you are finally acting because the virus multiplied during the 14 days you were deciding. This is not a solvable problem under the current institutional architecture. And I mean that precisely. The structure of democratic governance, the structure of market economies, the structure of political incentive systems, all of them are optimized for responding to present conditions, not future ones. They are optimized for reacting to visible crises, not preventing invisible ones. They are optimized for the short term, and pandemics punish the short term with mathematical precision. The Korea paper showed that early action does not even cost more economically. The pandemic, not the public health response, drives the economic damage. Cities that acted early had the same economic outcomes as cities that delayed, but with dramatically fewer deaths. The economy versus lives framing is a false dilemma produced by the same institutional short-termism that produces the delay. There is no trade-off. There is only the illusion of one, created by the gap between immediate visibility and exponential reality. And yet the framing persists, because it serves the same institutional purposes it served in 1918. It gives decision-makers a reason to delay that sounds responsible. Protecting the economy, preserving morale, avoiding panic. These are not irrational goals. They are the goals the system was designed to pursue. The problem is that pursuing them during the first week of a pandemic is the single most destructive thing you can do. I keep coming back to the image of Wilmer Krusen on the evening of September 27th, sitting in his office, reading the reports from the Navy Yard, knowing that 600 sailors were sick, knowing that physicians were begging him to cancel the parade, and deciding to let 200,000 people crowd together on Broad Street the next morning. I keep trying to imagine what was going through his mind, and I think the honest answer is that he was not thinking about the exponential curve. He was thinking about the war bonds. He was thinking about the federal government's expectations. He was thinking about the political consequences of being the official who cancelled the biggest public event of the year. He was thinking about the things that the system had trained him to think about. And somewhere in the Philadelphia Navy Yard, in the bodies of sailors who had already been infected, the virus was doubling. The 1918 pandemic did not end cleanly. It came in 3 waves. The first wave, in the spring of 1918, was relatively mild. The second wave, August through December, was the catastrophe. The third wave struck in the winter and spring of 1919. By the summer of 1919, the virus had burned through enough of the population to bring transmission below replacement level, and the pandemic receded. And then something remarkable happened. The world forgot. The most lethal event of the 20th century, an event that killed somewhere between 17 million and 100 million people, that orphaned hundreds of thousands of children, that caused the collapse of public services in major cities across the developed world, was largely erased from public memory within a generation. There were no major memorials. There was no National Day of Remembrance. There was no sustained public reckoning with the failures that amplified the death toll. The armistice that ended the First World War on November 11th, 1918, arrived just weeks after the worst of the pandemic, and the relief and celebration of the war's end overwhelmed the grief and horror of the pandemic. People wanted to move on. And they did. The forgetting of the 1918 pandemic was not a gradual cultural drift. It was rapid, deliberate in its silence, and nearly total. By the mid-1920s, the pandemic had essentially vanished from public discourse. It did not appear in school curricula. It was not commemorated in annual remembrances. It was not studied in military academies as a case study in institutional failure. It was, in the most literal sense, unmemorialized, there are theories about why. The historian Alfred Crosby, who wrote one of the first major books about the pandemic in 1976, argued that the flu was overshadowed by the war. The armistice arrived on November 11th, 1918, less than a month after the worst week of the pandemic, and the celebration of the war's end overwhelmed the grief. People who had endured 4 years of war news and 18 months of pandemic death chose, understandably and perhaps necessarily, to focus on the hopeful story rather than the catastrophic one. The war had a narrative arc, a beginning, a middle, and an end that could be called victory. The pandemic had no narrative arc. It arrived, it killed, and it receded, and there was no one to blame, no enemy to defeat, no flag to plant. But I think there is a deeper reason the pandemic was forgotten, and it connects directly to why the lessons are being unlearned right now. The pandemic exposed the failure of institutions. It showed that the federal government had prioritized the war over public health. It showed that censorship had killed people. It showed that the Surgeon General had been wrong, that local health officials had been overwhelmed, that the medical profession had been powerless. Remembering the pandemic meant confronting the failure of the systems that people depended on. And confronting that failure is uncomfortable. It undermines trust. It creates anxiety. It suggests that the institutions you rely on to protect you are, under certain conditions, structurally incapable of doing so. Forgetting was easier, and so the world forgot. The forgetting created a vacuum, and into that vacuum flowed a century of institutional confidence that had never been tested against the specific challenge it was designed to address. Public health agencies grew. Surveillance systems were built. The WHO was founded in 1948. The CDC was established in 1946. Pandemic preparedness plans were drafted, updated, and filed in binders that accumulated on shelves. The institutional infrastructure was impressive on paper, but it had never been stress-tested against a novel pathogen moving at exponential speed through a politically complicated environment. When COVID arrived in 2020, the stress test happened, and the results confirmed what Philadelphia had demonstrated a century earlier. The institutions were too slow. The information was there, but the response lagged. The economic pressures argued for delay. The political pressures argued for reassurance. And the gap between the speed of the virus and the speed of the institutions determined the shape of the pandemic. And now, in 2025 and 2026, something is happening that is qualitatively different from the forgetting that followed 1918. The institutions themselves are being dismantled. In 1920, the world forgot the lessons but kept the institutions. In 2026, the institutions are being stripped for parts. The surveillance capacity is being reduced. The workforce is being fired. The international partnerships are being abandoned. The funding is being cut. This is not forgetting. This is erasure. And the distinction matters because forgetting is recoverable. You can relearn what you forgot. Erasure is harder to reverse. You cannot quickly rebuild a workforce of trained epidemiologists who have been let go. You cannot quickly reconstitute an international surveillance network that has been defunded. You cannot quickly rejoin an international organization whose trust you have broken by walking away. The institutional memory of how to respond to a pandemic is not stored in documents, it is stored in people, in the epidemiologists who know how to design a surveillance protocol, in the laboratory technicians who know how to process samples, in the field investigators who know how to trace contacts, in the international health officers who have relationships with counterparts in other countries. When you fire those people, the memory walks out the door with them. The documents remain on the shelves, But documents do not respond to outbreaks. People do, and the people are leaving. This is the context in which the Ebola outbreak in the dark is playing out. This is the context in which H5N1 is evolving in dairy cattle across 17 states. This is the context in which the next novel pathogen, whatever it is, wherever it emerges, will enter the institutional infrastructure of the United States and the world. An infrastructure that is weaker, slower, and less prepared than it was 5 years ago. An infrastructure in which the Wilmer Krusens of the world will face the same pressures as the original, with fewer staff, less funding, less international support, and less institutional memory to draw on when making the decision that the first week demands. Wilmer Krusen was not investigated. He was not censured. He was not removed from his position. He remained a respected figure in Philadelphia medicine for the rest of his life. Rupert Blue continued as Surgeon General until 1920 and later became a prominent advocate for national health insurance. The system that produced the catastrophe absorbed the catastrophe and continued operating as before. John M. Barry wrote that the influenza pandemic of 1918 was the first great collision between nature and modern science. What he meant was that for the first time, a pandemic struck a world that had the scientific infrastructure to understand what was happening, even if it could not yet defeat the pathogen. The tragedy was not the virus. The tragedy was that the understanding existed and was not used. The information was there. The doctors at Camp Devens described the pathology with precision that holds up a century later. The mathematics of exponential growth were well understood. The comparison between cities that acted early and cities that delayed was visible in real time, not just in retrospect. And none of it mattered, because the information existed in a system that was designed to ignore it. That system is the same system operating today. Its specific features have changed. The Sedition Act has been repealed. The Committee on Public Information no longer exists. But the structural dynamics, the subordination of public health to economic and political imperatives, the suppression of uncomfortable information, the institutional inertia that delays action during the only window when action matters, those dynamics have not changed. They are as fundamental to how power operates as exponential growth is to how viruses operate. And the next pandemic's death toll will be determined, as it was in 1918, not by the pathogen, not by the state of medical science, not by the size of the population, but by what happens in the first week. By whether the person sitting in Wilmer Krusen's chair, whoever they are, wherever they are, makes the call to act before the evidence demands it, or waits until the evidence is overwhelming and the window is closed. The math has been sitting in the literature for more than a century. The Hatchet paper quantified it. The Bootsma paper modeled it. The city-by-city data from 1918 proved it. The COVID experience confirmed it. Every simulation, every retrospective analysis, every comparison between cities that acted early and cities that delayed arrives at the same conclusion. The first week is everything, and we are not ready for it. Right now, as you are hearing this, the surveillance systems that would detect the first 2 to 10 cases of a novel pandemic pathogen are operating at reduced capacity. The agency that would coordinate the national response has lost 10% of its workforce. The international organization that would coordinate the global response has lost its largest financial contributor. The emergency preparedness programs that fund state and local health departments to prepare for exactly this scenario are facing 52% budget cuts. And right now, H5N1 is circulating in dairy cattle across 17 states, in wild birds on every continent, and in sporadic human spillovers whose case fatality rate is approximately 52%. A novel Ebola strain with no approved vaccine has been declared a public health emergency of international concern, with more than 500 cases across 2 countries. And the outbreak was detected only after more than 80 people had already died, in part because the international aid workers who serve as early warning systems had been pulled from the region. The calculation that Wilmer Krusen made on September 27, 1918, the calculation that traded a few days of economic normalcy for the lives of thousands of people, is not a historical curiosity. It is the default setting of every institution in the world. It is what systems do when they are not explicitly designed to do something else. And we have not designed them to do something else. Somewhere right now, in a body, in an animal, in a wet market, or a dairy farm, or a research laboratory, a virus is doubling. It does not know there is an economy. It does not know there is a war, or an election, or a budget negotiation. It does not know that the people responsible for detecting it have been laid off, or that the organization responsible for coordinating the response to it has lost its funding, or that the country with the most advanced scientific infrastructure on Earth has decided that pandemic preparedness is an expense it can cut. It is just doubling. The way it doubled in the bodies of sailors at the Philadelphia Navy Yard in September of 1918, while a public health official sat in his office weighing the political consequences of cancelling a parade. The parade went ahead. 12,000 people were dead within 6 weeks, 17,000 within 6 months. The morgue held 500 bodies in a building designed for 36. The steam shovels dug the trenches. The seminarians dug the graves. A child watched her brother's body carried to the sidewalk, where a wagon with no coffins waited. And a man named Max Starkloff, in a city 460 miles to the west, looked at the same data and made a different choice. The math has not changed. The window has not changed. The only question is the decision. And the decision will be made in the first week by someone under pressure in a system designed to choose wrong. That is not a prediction. That is the structural architecture of every pandemic response in recorded history. 1918 proved it. 2020 confirmed it. And the evidence that it is happening again is not in the past tense. It is accumulating, right now, in real time, in the bodies of birds and cattle, and the occasional unlucky human, in the shrinking budgets and empty desks of the agencies that were supposed to be watching. The virus does not need your institutions to fail. It just needs them to be slow. And slow is what institutions are.